Grace, peace, love, and hope to you from the God who was Christ. In fact, what we do then is we then create all sorts of rules about the body. If you came from a more conservative tradition, or maybe from a different era in even Lutheran tradition, you might have a whole list of do's and don'ts, right? You may be, I don't drink, I don't dance, I don't go to movies, I don't, we don't, what's the saying? Don't drink, don't chew, don't go with girls that do, right? I mean, there was all these ways in which we created rules to try and make a spiritual life happen for us. You can do this, you can't do that, as though that was how we defined living a spiritual life. But what if flesh isn't the best way to talk about that word sarx in Greek? What if, as Father Richard Rohr suggests, it's really better translated as ego? It kind of shifts everything. Because instead of having a war between my spiritual thoughts and my body, instead, it's a war between the way of the Spirit and the way of Dave's ego. If I was going to do a bumper sticker, I would say, your ego is the enemy of your happiness. What keeps us from being whole and happy is this constant thing going on inside of us about, how am I looking? Am I getting credit? Am I getting blame? Do people give me the proper amount of respect? All these ego things that are constantly chirping at us, the comparison thinking that we have, it keeps us from being in right relationship with each other in the world. So what if we retranslated a portion of that Galatians text this way? The works of the ego. Live by the Spirit, I say, and do not gratify the desires of the ego. For what the ego desires is opposed to the Spirit, and what the Spirit desires is opposed to the ego. For they are opposed to each other to prevent you from doing what you want. The ego wants to serve itself, whereas the soul wants to serve others. And what keeps us from doing that and doing that correctly is even wondering, what if I serve others, but they don't thank me? Well, that's an ego question. What if I help somebody and then they make the same mistakes that keep putting them back into the same place? Well, that's kind of a little bit of an ego question too. In some ways, ego keeps us from being able to love and to be in relationship correctly. If you are a math person, I offer for you Einstein's equation. Ego, 1 over knowledge. The more knowledge, the less the ego. The lesser the knowledge, the more the ego. And so what is it that we need to know that's going to reduce our ego needs? Well, we go right to the beginning of that Galatians text. It is for freedom that Christ set you free. It is for freedom, ultimate freedom. Freedom from the demands of your ego. In that gospel text, we hear all these people who keep coming up to Jesus and they have ego needs. First you hear the disciples. They get to the Samaritan village and they don't welcome them, so they're saying, so they dissed us. That was a whole bunch of shade that got thrown our way. Let us rain down fire and brimstone, right? Because that's what you should do. Let's shock and awe this place. Instead, Jesus rebukes them and says, that's your ego talking. And again, the people who come up and say, I'll follow you, but let me take care of some personal business first, whatever that is, which seems legitimate to say goodbye to your family or bury your dad. And Jesus says, yeah, you're not ready. You're counting the cost with your ego having too much of a price. Instead, what if you were totally free, radically free? What if we could live in such a way that our freedom was expansive? Imagine just for a second. Imagine if we could say no to the powers of self-indulgence that exist in ourselves all the time, and instead said yes to the freedom to love. God, I got 2 big questions for myself and for all of us today. What if it really wasn't about you? I mean, really. And secondly, then, what if the path to the life that you truly want is found by forgetting your ego and loving other people? What if what Paul writes in Galatians and what Jesus teaches is actually true? That when you lose yourself and all your ego needs, you actually find your very life, the life that you want, the connections, the heart, the meaning and the purpose. And instead of then wondering, how am I going to get mine, we let that go, and then something else comes in, this fruit of the Spirit of love and joy and peace and patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. So what if these were the measure of your success in your life? Not what your bank account says, not what your neighbor says, but instead, do you have more love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control? What if this was the way we measured our leaders? All the leaders that we want to support, do they exemplify ego, or do they exemplify love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control? Brothers and sisters, gentleness, kindness is taking a beating, right? And if we're not going to champion it, who will? What if we were to say, let's let our hearts become pliable and to become less about winning and more about loving? That is actually going to get us to the destination that we've always wanted. Well, I have to give you a warning. If you do this, if we do this, if we let love and not ego rule our hearts, then that means that our hearts will more and more shape towards the heart of Jesus. And that means that the things that break God's heart will break our hearts. Like children held in detention cages, or hunger, or places in the world that don't let young girls go to school. I couldn't bring myself to put that horrific image of the father and daughter that we've all seen this last week that drowned in the Rio Grande up here. But if that picture doesn't break your heart and change our way of seeing things in our culture, then I fear for where we are. We need to have our hearts broken by the things that break the heart of God, and it means getting out of our partisan bickering, out of our nationalistic understandings. It means opening our eyes to what really is happening, and that is that people are suffering in the world, and we are called to love them. It means that we will no longer be enamored with the lifestyles of the rich and famous, but instead we will see the world through the lens of love. We will instead change our vision. And if we change our vision, then that changes the way that we walk. Right? We now move into a new space. We begin to walk according to the Spirit, which is exactly where Paul was headed with this whole Galatians thing. You see, the community in Galatians were full of ego. It's like, we do this our way, that's the right way. And I'd say, no, that's the wrong way. And so they were fighting. In fact, they'd stopped meeting together. They were meeting separately and having they were already doing that favorite indoor sport of religion of saying, let's split off and have our own true community. And Paul says that's ego talking. What if we were to ask that question of ourselves, honestly, at every time that there's a family or a church or a national dispute, where we just said for a second, I wonder if where I am is my ego talking right now. Let me think about that. Yeah, okay, I got to change my position because I can't let the ego drive the ship. Instead, we need to let the power of God that comes to us in this basic law, love your neighbor as you love yourself. And love works no ill against our neighbor. the great leader, Father Greg Boyle, he talks about when he imagines what the gospel is. He says, imagine a circle that has, and then imagine that no one is outside that circle. Those two actions. So imagine, who is my neighbor? Imagine a circle that incorporates everybody, not just in this room, but also in this community, and not just this community, but across all those artificial things we call borders. And not just even the human family, but what if our neighbors included all of creation itself? Then our ego gets out of the way, and we begin to act fully as sons and daughters of the Most High. May God give us that vision. May God grant us that purpose and direction. And may God do so soon. Amen.